Hi, everybody. Welcome to our third section of central nervous system. So hopefully we'll finish up the PowerPoint this time. So we finished talking about your cerebrum for most part. We talked about different parts of the cerebral cortex and the specific function in terms of, for instance, somatosensory cortex versus association area, the visual area, motor area, the multimodal association area, etc. So we are going to continue talking about the concept of lateralization and what we identified as cerebral dominance as one of the last topics of the cerebrum. And then we're going to shift gear to the rest of the brain structures, which include your diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. So lateralization again implies the division of labor between the hemispheres, and what that means will become clear in just a minute. Now, before we go forward, I want you guys to understand that we have what we identified as cerebral dominance, which means that's the lobe that is going to help us understand a language. So we know that the area of the brain that helps us understand written words or spoken words are your Wernicke's area, which is located as part of the posterior association lobe. Now, what we do need to understand here is that 90% of the humans are identified as left side dominance. Now, because of the concept of contralateral, that means all of these individuals are going to be right-handed, which is kind of true. If you look around, most of the population are identified as right-handed, which means what does that mean in terms of their brain is that the left hemisphere is responsible for understanding language. Now, the other 10%, the halves of the brains are reversed. Therefore, the right side of the brain is going to be dominant, which means that they have the understanding of the speech localized into the right hemisphere or cerebral hemisphere. So what does that mean for the areas like Wernicke's areas and Broca's area when we're talking about the opposite lobe? So for instance, for me, I am right-handed, which means I am left side dominant, which means my language is being processed by the left hemisphere, but the right hemisphere on the same region would be responsible for understanding the emotional overtone of language. So if I'm talking to you, you can notice two things. You can notice that the spoken words that I'm telling you, and you can also understand the language, the emotion that I put into it. Am I sad, happy, anxious, excited, etc., right? So if you look at your PowerPoint, you notice it says Wernicke's area. And this is for people who are dominantly left-sided, or their left side is the dominant. If their left side is understanding a speech, then the right side is understand the emotional overtone for the Wernicke's area. That's what? That's lateralization. As in one hemisphere is doing one thing and the other hemisphere on the same region is doing something different. For Broca's area, which is ability to create speech, the left side is controlling your speech or ability to create speech, versus the right side is controlling the emotional overtone that is created through speech. So as I'm talking to you again, I can make the words and then add an emotional. As I'm talking to you, I am excited. That excitement that is translating in my voice is coming from my right Broca's area, which is located in the frontal lobe of my brain. Now, when we look at the white matter of the brain, and again, if you don't recall what is white matter, those were the myelinated axons of the neurons that are located in the cerebrum. So there are these white matters, these myelinated axons allow for three parts or three sections of the nervous system to communicate with each other. Now, these structures are identified as association, commissural, and projection fibers. And they're really easy to understand. So I tell my students to think about it like this. If you have one hemisphere, you want to have communication within that hemisphere. For instance, you want the frontal lobe to be communicating with the parietal, with the occipital, with the temporal, with the insula. So that's localized communication, and that's known as the association fibers. Commissural fibers takes it a step further. You have one hemisphere and you have left hemisphere, right? So right hemisphere and left hemisphere. These two hemispheres want to be able to communicate with each other, and they do that through a structure called commissural fibers, and they form a structure called corpus callosum, which is a visible structure on the brain. So this is, again, commissural fibers is communicating between two hemispheres of the brain. The last are called projection. Again, when you project something, you're going farther, right? So projection fibers are very long vertical fibers that are going from the hemispheres and connected to the lower aspect of the brain, including your brainstem and eventually your spinal cord. So in this picture, you can see again, red is localized to one hemisphere. The green dots, which are also depicted here, are communicating between your two hemispheres. And then projection fibers are coming from both hemispheres and going farther down the brain, including your brainstem and the spinal cord. Now, moving away from cerebrum, which is basically what we've been focusing on so far, let's go ahead and talk about diencephalon. So diencephalon has two main structures, which you can see here. This larger structure, which is your thalamus. The smaller structure underneath it, which is the hypothalamus. And then kind of the epithalamus that sits more posterior to that. And the main structure within that would be the pineal gland. And I'll talk about that in just a matter. There is a high concentration of gray matter in there. They do a lot of functions. One of the most important function of the thalamus, which is 80% of your diencephalon, is to act as a gateway to your cerebral cortex. So cerebral cortex was the most superficial aspect of your cerebrum, and thalamus is going to be the gateway for the rest of the receptors or sensory data to communicate with your cerebral cortex. So notice what it says. All communication to the cerebral cortex is relayed through the thalamus, with the exception of olfactory senses. So what does that exactly mean? So let's say data is coming from your eyes. How does it know that it needs to go to the occipital lobe? It first goes to your thalamus, and thalamus says, this is the data from the optic nerve, so it needs to go to the occipital lobe. Let's say data comes from your ear. Data first goes into your thalamus, and from thalamus it says, I belong to the temporal lobe because I am the sense of hearing. Another function thalamus has is that it tones down or amplifies the signal, allowing you, for instance, to focus on a person's voice on a noisy environment. So basically you have the ability to tone out anything that is extra and amplify the one that is your focus. Hypothalamus is extremely difficult. It's extremely complex structure. Do not look at the size. It is extremely important for our survival. It is connected to our endocrine system. It controls the release of many, many hormones in our body from the gland that's connected to the hypothalamus called the pituitary gland, which is this gland right here. It has functions in terms of autonomic effects, in terms of your sympathetic parasympathetic. It helps with your thermoregulation, as in controls your body temperature. It helps you with food and water intake. Basically, it tells you when you're hungry or when you're thirsty. It helps you with sleep. So you may have heard of it. There is a hormone called melatonin. This hormone actually gets released not from the hypothalamus, but it gets released from your epithalamus. But the hormone release is under the control of hypothalamus. It helps you with your emotional response and helping you with creating memory. More importantly, is the role of hypothalamus in controlling the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. So hormone secretion for the anterior pituitary gland, which is the structure you see in pink color right here, is done by your hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is directly controlling that. The hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus itself and then gets stored in the posterior pituitary gland for later use is also extremely important. So posterior pituitary gland, which is the structure you see in purple, notice it's the same color as the hypothalamus because it does not produce its hormones. All it's doing, it is storing the hormones that the hypothalamus has made. Please do note that there are two main hormones that the posterior pituitary gland stores for your hypothalamus. One hormone is ADH, which is essential for the water supply in your body, controls your water supply and give you your thirst response partially. And the second one is oxytocin, which is a hormone known also as the love hormone, essential during childbirth, during creation of the emotion of what we consider love between parents and child. It is released during lactation, and it also creates, again, emotion, any type of emotion we identify as love. So in analytic circles, they call oxytocin the love hormone. Epithalamus, which again I said is the smallest structure, more posterior to the thalamus, it is containing a major structure called pineal gland or pineal body. So you may see it in a textbook called pineal body. Now, pineal gland or pineal body is the gland that actually produces and secretes the hormone melatonin. Again, you may have heard of it. This is the one that controls basically your sleep and wake cycle. However, the release of these hormones from your epithalamus is under the control of hypothalamus. So hypothalamus is the one that decides when these hormones are going to be released. Next part of your brain, you have your brain stem, which is made up of three structures. It is the most inferior structure. It is made up of brainstem in order, going to pons and medulla oblongata. Please do note that there are a total of 12 cranial nerves that are basically coming off of your brain. And out of those 12 nerves, nerve number 3 through number 12, which is the 10 nerves, are directly associated with your brain stem. And they're extremely important in programming your autonomic division of the nervous system, which is branched into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. It is also important in terms of integration of your auditory and visual reflexes. Now, what is the job of your midbrain? So midbrain is the top structure within your brainstem. It is important in terms of multiple structure. It has a structure called tactum, which is broken down to superior and inferior colliculi, and you can visualize them right here. So these two structures right here would be your superior, and these two structures right below would be your inferior colliculi. Superior colliculi are extremely important for visual reflexes, giving you the ability to track objects within your field of view. So when you read a book or if something is in front of you, your eyes are going to move, not necessarily your head, until the object is out of your field of view, and then you continue rotating your head. Inferior colliculi is essential for auditory reflexes. For instance, you being startled by a loud noise and turning your head to that direction is associated with your inferior colliculi. You also have a structure called cerebral pedicles, which are basically tracks for your motor responses that goes from the cerebrum all the way to the spinal cord. And one of the more important structures that I do want you guys to know is called substantia nigra. So substantia nigra are these half moon structures that you see right here, these ones and these ones right here. They are basal nuclei, which basically imply that they are gray matter embedded inside the white matter. And they're involved in terms of creation of the voluntary movement or skeletal movement. They have noticed that patients that have Parkinson's disease, which basically those individuals who have severe tremors, they do have degradation of the neurons in this specific part of the midbrain. The other structure you have is these two kind of larger structure called the red nuclei. These are highly enriched with iron, and they do appear to play a role in flexion movements of your muscles. And the last thing I do want you guys to know is that within the 10 nerves that are associated with your midbrain, nerve number 3 and 4, which are called oculomotor and trochlear respectively, are directly originate from your midbrain. I do want you guys to know the name of the nerve as well as the Roman numeral for the nerve. CN, by the way, if you haven't figured it out, stands for cranial nerve. Pons is the larger structure. It's typically depicted as this kind of bulging structure that pokes out from underneath the brain. It sits between your midbrain and medulla oblongata. There are 4 main nerves that comes from that called nerve number 5, 6, 7, and 8. And these nerves are associated with or play a role in terms of respiration, controlling your bladder input, give you the ability to release saliva, play a role in facial sensation and expressions, production and release of tears, creation of equilibrium and eye movement. Please do note that the typical exam question, if I use the word secondary respiration center, then your answer would be pons. So even though pons is listed as an important structure in terms of respiration, it is still secondary to your medulla oblongata, which we'll talk about momentarily. So medulla oblongata, which is your last structure, its continuation of it becomes your spinal cord. It does have, like the other parts of the brain, it does consider or contain what we call pyramids, which are these two extensions you see right here. And these are ridges that are found on the ventral side or anterior aspect of the medulla oblongata. And they are the ones that follow and continue track the motor responses down the spinal cord. So they're originating from the brainstem and then continue down all the way to the spinal cord. So they originate from the cerebrum through the brainstem and all the way to the spinal cord. The nerves that are originating from medulla oblongata again would be your nerve number 9, 10, 11, and 12. And what is the main functions of medulla oblongata? It's identified as your primary respiration center. So even though I just said breathing respiratory center, do identify that, use that keyword, add it for yourself. This is primary respiration center. It's also identified as your primary cardiovascular center. Basically, it's going to be controlling your heartbeat or heart rate. It also controls your blood pressure by adjusting the diameter of your blood vessels. It also controls your involuntary actions like hiccuping, vomiting, sneezing, swallowing, and coughing. Within your brainstem, you have these very beautiful structures that are depicted. You can see them kind of cross-sectioning between midbrain, going down the pons, and eventually medulla oblongata. So these red dots are these long extensions you can kind of see extending throughout your brainstem and then expanding through your cerebrum. So basically what you see in purple as these arrows, sorry, not the arrows, as this kind of a within your midbrain structure, as well as your pons and medulla oblongata, are these little dots when you do a cross section of the sample. These are called reticular formations. What is their importance? They give you consciousness and alertness. So they're extremely important for you being present in the moment. In another sense, these are basically make you be aware of your environment. They also give you ability to ignore repetitive, inconsequential stimuli that are present around you. For instance, if you have, let's say you have a watch on your hand or you have your ring on, after a while, you don't notice that it's on your skin because the neurons, even though they're sending signals, your brain decides to ignore them, right? But when your cold or your ring is shift on your finger, then you notice it because, again, that original location was changed. So a lot of us, it's really interesting because basically it doesn't allow our brain to get overwhelmed with a lot of information. It kind of says, these are unimportant, they've been repeating over and over again, so we're going to ignore them unless there is a shift or change in that. Next part of the brain we have is cerebellum. Cerebellum sits on the posterior inferior aspect of the brain. It does have 3 lobes. It has a somewhat of a smaller lobe on the top called the anterior lobe. It has a relatively larger lobe on the bottom called the posterior lobe, and a small tiny lobe called follicular nodular lobe. Like cerebellum is also made up of 2 halves, and those 2 halves are connected via a structure called the vermis. And here's the vermis right here. So here's your 2 hemispheres of the cerebellum. There are folds, like the folds that we saw in your cerebrum. Those folds are called, or the ridges on the brain called gyri. But in case of the cerebellum, those ridges are called folia. There is a fissure that divides your cerebellum to 2 halves. And then the other interesting fact about your cerebellum is the white matter, which is deep to the gray matter. So here on the outer aspects is more gray matter. Deep at the center is the white matter. That white matter is formed this pattern that looks like branches of trees. Therefore, it's referred to as the arborete. And within that arborete, so here's your arborete, within that you have other gray matters, which are your deep cerebral nuclei. What is the main function of the cerebellum? It receives inputs from basically all over the place, and it receives data from your cerebrum and all of your senses, and it coordinates your movements. So if I ask you in simple terms, define the function of the cerebellum, it is responsible for a smooth and coordinated motions or movement of your skeletal muscle. So again, if I ask you what is the most important function of cerebellum, it is responsible for a smooth and coordinated movement or motions of the skeletal muscle. Does it mean that this is the only function? No, but it is one of the most important functions you do need to know for cerebellum. Finishing up with a couple of slides on limbic system and the spinal cord. Limbic system is identified as your emotional brain. It is part of the brain that helps you create memories, connected to a lot of your emotions. in terms of creating either fear or pleasure or happiness inside of you based on your previous experiences. Three major structures you have. One is called cingulate gyrus, which are kind of these longer structure or kind of semi-lunar dome-shaped structure you see going around. These structures are responsible for expressing emotions through gestures. So for instance, if you talk and you talk with your hands, a lot of people do that. That means they have a relatively highly active cingulate gyrus. The other structure we have is hippocampus, which is this structure right here. Hippocampus is extremely important in terms of creating long-term memory and behavior, and there is the direct linking to your autonomic nervous system and behavior of stress or happiness. And then amygdala, which is the last part, is that little circle that you see. This is amygdala, and amygdala is responsible for processing fear and memories based on the emotional impact. Basically, it's identified as aversion center. If you develop that feeling that this is going to cause harm for you, you will avoid that environment or that scenario. Last thing we're going to talk about again is the spinal cord. Couple of things you need to know about spinal cord. It is identified as the highway between your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. So it communicates between brain and your body. It collects all of the sensory data and sends them to brain. And then if there is to be a motor response, that motor response gets sent out through the spinal cord. It's also identified as your major center for reflexes. So assuming, let's say, you touch something hot or cold or sharp, and you want to pull your hand away, that happens using your skeletal muscle moving involuntarily. A skeletal muscle, again, moving involuntarily. And that control is done by your spinal cord. There is a total of 31 pairs of nerves coming off of your spinal cord, and these nerves are named based on their location. And you can kind of see this. If they're associated with the neck, it's called the cervical. If they're associated with your thoracic region or your chest region, those are your thoracic spinal nerves. Lower back is lumbar, and then you have sacral and coccygeal. Coccygeal is not labeled here, but sacral nerves that are associated with the sacrum, and then coccyx, the coccygeal nerve. How are they divided in terms of numbers? You have 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal, for a total of 31 nerves. And that's about it for our lecture on the central nervous system. Our next recording would be on peripheral nervous system, so keep tuned.